All right, good morning. We are in the midst of our review, our A.P.E.S review, 157 Reasons to Go A.P.E.S. I think on the last video we left off at, we looked at El Enso and La Nina. I'd like to talk about this first group here. You can see I'm kind of labeling it with that, the nitrogen fixation, ammonification, nitrification, assimilation, and denitrification. These are all related to the nitrogen cycle. And if you remember, we learned quite a bit about the nitrogen cycle earlier in the year. Plants need nitrogen. And there's a lot in the atmosphere. All right, if you remember the big problem with nitrogen in the atmosphere, it is not in the form that basically the plants need. The plant basically needs this form, which is called nitrates, and typically that's the nitrates that are found, for example, in fertilizers. So in effect, that this sort of natural nitrogen cycle is not does not provide enough nitrogen for the plant, then supplemental fertilizers being used. I've always thought sometimes students have a hard time figuring the nuances of the nitrogen cycle. I think the easiest way to remember it is think of the atmosphere, all right, as a nitrogen savings bank. All right, where you can make withdrawals and deposits just like you could a typical bank. That's all really, in effect, this nitrogen cycle is doing. It is a complex cycle. Basically, there are some bacteria involved, different types of bacteria that help change this nitrogen in the form of, this is atmospheric nitrogen, N2, ultimately into NO3, which is the nitrate. Nitrate polyatomic ion. This is what dissolves in the water, and then the water takes up this form of nitrogen to the plants via transpiration. After that, after the plant dies off, this particular or any excess nitrates, I should say, are basically converted back. So here's the cycle. Basically, nitrogen. This is called fixed. The nitrogen is fixed. It must be converted into ammonia by bacteria. That's one type of bacteria. Ammonification, decomposers convert organic waste into ammonia. All right, there's your ammonia again, which is NH3. Where's our ammonia here? All right, and basically the nitrification, ammonia is converted to nitrate ions. Assimilation, the inorganic N is converted into assimilation, just building up, basically putting together. The nitrogen is used in DNA, and it's also used in amino acids and proteins that we have, and that plants have, and all living organisms have. And then the denitrification, basically there's a different type of bacteria, denitrifying bacteria, that convert the ammonia back into nitrogen. This particular cycle, this is really the cycle here for it. And this is probably, to my way of thinking, one of the most amazing things of all of science. If you remember, by the law of conservation of mass, the nitrogen never changes. So basically, this is the nitrogen fixation. The fixation a little bit of fixation can take place in effect by lightning. I think about 10% it's estimated. All right. In other words, all this is doing is basically splitting the N2 into two ends, if you will. All right. This is the nitrogen fixation, and you can see here the nitrogen fixing bacteria, which would be found in root nodules of legumes. All right, would be basically converted into nitrates in the soil by nitrifying bacteria. The plant absorbs it, You can see through death, decomposition after the plant or animal is decomposed. The ammonia and other nitrogen-containing compounds are now in the soil. These are inorganic, and basically the nitrification right here, I wouldn't get too hung up in nitrates and nitrites. This one you have to remember. The main thing you have to understand is that there's an atmospheric component of this nitrogen cycle, and there's a soil component of the nitrogen cycle, and that there are bacteria involved in order to make all this work. And again, if you think of it as basically as the atmosphere as a nitrogen savings bank, I think it'll really help you out a great deal. I would strongly encourage you to go over either this diagram that I have now. You can freeze this particular one, or we have a picture. Remember, we had it on the board earlier this year. You should have that in your records, or just look up the nitrogen cycle. There are a myriad of images on Google that will help you out with that. All right, so these are basically all with the end cycle. Phosphorus is also a key element needed for living things. We need it in our cells, for example. We need it as a component of phospholipid membranes. The phosphorus cycle is very slow. Earlier this year, remember, you guys did a very, very fine job of remembering that there is no phosphorus in the phosphorus cycle does not have a gaseous component. That's important for that release by weathering of rocks. So rocks weather produces soil. It's a major limiting factor for plant growth. And so in other words, that's where sometimes supplemental fertilizers would be used. All right, we'd need to use some more fertilizer if not necessary, if not quite there. All right, the next two we have talked about extensively, I believe. The carbon, basically part of the carbon cycle, photosynthesis and cell respiration. Photosynthesis, plants convert atmospheric CO2 or atmospheric carbon, which is carbon dioxide, into complex carbohydrates like C6H12O6. And then these carbohydrates are subsequently used by the plant and by us, if you will, in terms of our own aerobic respiration. So these are almost opposite processes, not quite, but basically they are. The reactants for photosynthesis would be carbon dioxide and water, plus sunlight, of course. The reactants or the products would be oxygen and glucose, whereas in aerobic respiration, aerobic, remember, is with oxygen. Remember, anaerobic is without oxygen. All right, so that's an important distinction. We are going to see a anaerobic digester later on this week at the City of West Chicago waste treatment plant. All right, and then the largest reservoirs, if you will, of carbon, one would be carbonate rocks, and another one would be the oceans. The carbon cycle, I think we went over this earlier. Again, you can look this up. I know you guys are familiar with most of this, I believe, but this really ties into a lot of key concepts. You can see atmospheric CO2 can be taken up by photosynthesis, all right, by plants and trees and such. I think we've talked a lot this year about how deforestation reduces this rate of photosynthesis. There's not as many trees, so there's more atmospheric CO2, which means there's more global warming. The plant exhibits respiration and produces some CO2 here. Plants can feed, or feeding can occur here. Respiration from the rabbit, you can see just from the living organisms, just as an example. Let's see, a carbon sink. This would be the couple of the things we were just talking about, the reservoirs. Coal, oil, peat, and natural gas. These would be the, you can see when these die off, it's the fossil fuels theorized were formed. Decay of by decomposing bacteria, fungi, and worms would be important. Let's see. And then when these fossil fuels are combusted by auto and factory emissions, very, very important, that contributes to more atmospheric CO2, which if not taken up by photosynthesis would lead to more global warming. And this is the big key in our society today. Are we causing global warming by having more cars, by having more energy, by having more power requirements, more factories, that type of thing? Biotic and abiotic would be the living and non-living components of an ecosystem. I think that's an easier one. Just think of biology. By the way, anytime you see a or an as a prefix, it means no or not. All right, so an example would be biotic would be living, abiotic would be not living. Aerobic would be oxygen, respiration using oxygen. Anaerobic would be no oxygen. All right, so that's a key distinction. Producer and autotrophs, organisms that make their own food. Those would be green plants largely. There are some chemotrophs, I think we mentioned, that do not use sunlight, but they can still make their own food. Trophic levels in the triangular effect here. The producers are at the base of a pyramid, ecological pyramid. Then the second level will be the primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. Remember the different trophic levels. All right, good thing to remember with that. Energy flow through food webs. 10% of the energy is transferred to the next trophic level. And the reasons are usable energy lost is heat, the second law of thermodynamics. Not all biomass is digested and absorbed. And also, an interesting part, predators do expend energy to catch prey. So that's an important distinction as well. All right, next page. Trust this as a help as we go through it. You can look at parts of it. You can look at as we go over and over with this. Let's go over a couple of concepts we talked about here. Succession is basically changes and development of communities. You can see primary and secondary succession. I would anticipate you would get at least 1 or 2 questions on these, especially the multiple choice section. So let's look at these. The primary succession is development of communities in a lifeless area not previously inhabited by life.